I'll get started, and I'll also start recording. So just be aware that if you have questions and in my response, your questions will be also recorded. So welcome everybody, and thank you for attending our monthly webinar. My name is Dr. T. Wu, and today we are presenting a special case. I'm fairly sure many of you have probably heard of the Boeing 737 MAX A and the various troubles that it is in and the tragedies. Today, we're going to largely take a look at this endeavor of developing the plane from a project, program, and portfolio perspective. And what are some of the lessons I think we can learn? So let me start with a brief introduction of myself. My name is Dr. T. Wu, and I am the CEO and founder of PMO Advisory. PMO Advisory is a PMI registered education provider, and we provide training and project management consulting services. So here's a little bit about my background. I think the takeaway from my background is I try to do a lot of things in my career, and I am a working professional. I still am. I still lead engagements and consult with various clients. I was a previous head, for example, of a global project management services for one of the big four tax audit advisory company. Today, I run PMO Advisory. I'm also a professor at multiple universities. And I'm also heavily engaged on the standard, the professional development side of project management, including a team lead for the US ISO team. I'm a US delegate, as well as various roles, PMI Global, chapters, and you could see some of the professional engagements that I do. So I like to think of myself as somebody who can bring various perspectives. Combined with my experience and certification, I'm certified in project, program, portfolio, and risk, to bring to bear to a particular problem. I don't assume anything I say here will be completely new, because I do think the case of Boeing is fairly well known. It's hard to go by a day, open newspaper, and not come across some latest update about this ongoing saga. But I do hope to bring you a fresh perspective, examining the various problems using the lens of project, program, and portfolio. And that's my dominant purpose for today. So really is to give you that management perspective. So I hope by the end of the webinar, you should be able to understand what happened and the consequences, identify and describe the key project, program, portfolio management attributes, and also articulate the key lessons. And I actually have my proposal. It's a little pet peeve of mine, but I'll save that for the end. Now, as everybody knows, this is actually ongoing. So nothing I speak about today is really final, except perhaps with the Indonesian National Transportation. They did issue their final report October 29th. I don't assume there's another report for that Lion Air incident. But a lot of it, much of it, including the criminal investigation by our own Justice Department into Boeing, these are all ongoing. So what I do plan to do is that as I glean new insights from the project management world, especially using those lens, project, program, portfolio lens, I may update this and re-deliver this webinar at a future time, whether that's 2 months, 3 months, half a year, that's way to be determined. And by the way, I welcome your feedback. Please, as you have questions, please use chat to ask them throughout the presentation. And frankly, your feedback will make determination whether this topic is of interest that we should do a future updated one based on this particular situation. So for some background, let's just cover what happened. Boeing developed the 737 MAX. And it's been serviced since about 2015. Of course, there's a ramp-up period. So in the 2015-16, very few jets were actually flying. The first tragedy happened October 29th, 2018. So roughly a little bit more than a year ago. And it was a domestic flight in Indonesia, and it crashed 13 minutes after took takeoff, and it crashed into Java Sea, killing all 189 passengers, crew members on the plane, And this caught the world's attention, not only because of the tragedy, of course, as you can imagine, but it was also this first major accident involving the Boeing 737 MAX series. And when you say MAX series, there's actually two planes that's been grounded. There's the MAX 8 and MAX 9. United Airlines, for example, uses MAX 9, American Airlines, Southwest, and probably most of the world tend to use the MAX 8 series. So sometimes you hear it 737 MAX 8, but actually MAX 9 is also grounded. At this time, at that time, Boeing promised full cooperation, of course, right after the tragedy, and that's, of course, to be expected. But you could see from their tone, their language, they believe it was more human error, potentially some kind of manual errors, not necessarily the plane's error. Initial report did pinpoint to the MCAS, and I'm pretty sure everybody heard of the maneuvering characteristic augmentation system if you actually learned and read up on the Boeing 737 MAX situation. And in short, it's just called the MCAS system. The problem or potential problem with the system was pinpointed actually pretty on. But at the time after Line Air, back in October of last year, it was mostly due to a lack of training. It was actually absent for the most part in the pilot's manual completely. So it's not even in the emergency kit or anything like that. Now, in the technical manual, you can find reference to the MCAS system, but most pilots are not engineers. So it wasn't designed for engineers to read. Fast forward very quickly, and of course, right on the year, as you can imagine, the Indonesia National Transportation Safety Committee completed their final report. And in their final report, they did it was an objective report by all global standards. They did blame, for example, some of the pilots for lack of training and anticipation. And later we'll even come to a more chilling fact at the end that could have prevented this first tragedy. But nonetheless, the main culprit was the MCAS system. And it was really the MCAS system over-reliance on one single sensor, the angle of attack. And at the time, they also believed the sensor was also defective. So you essentially created a single point of failure on a commercial airline. As I'm sure for those of you who are interested in risk, that is just a very, very high risk to accept. To have a commercial airline flying nearly 200 people, have reliance on a single sensor for safety. For those of you interested in complete report, throughout this presentation, I provided resources and links to what I consider to be fairly authoritative or at least objective sources of information. And later I'll come back for those of you who are interested to learn more. I'd be happy to share this video, and you can, of course, take a look and also these resources. So, for example, the full 322 report is at this link here. So you could connect there. So that was the first tragedy. After the first tragedy, of course, there was a lot of investigation. But as I mentioned, Boeing largely looked at the problem as a potential human problem. There were very little discussion of grounding the plane because it just didn't seem warranted. And FAA, of course, stand by their recommendation, and the Boeing kept on flying the plane. In hindsight, this was also a mistake, and I'll come back to that. The second tragedy occurred a little bit less than half a year later on March 10th, 2019 of this year. It was an international flight, but wasn't a particularly long distance flight, Ethiopia to Kenya. And it crashed just 6 minutes after takeoff. I'm sure if those of you interested in go YouTube, you could find really chilling details. And one point that I picked up, not only did it kill 157 passengers, the plane was crashing or flying at a speed toward the ground at almost 600 miles per hour. And initially, they actually couldn't find the crash site because there wasn't a lot of big pieces of the jet left. It created a crater of 32 feet deep, 92 feet in width, and 131 feet long. So it was obviously a harrowing experience. The next day, and to the shock of the world, actually, the FAA reaffirmed airworthiness of the MAX series. On the same day, China, another surprise, because typically FAA is considered one of the most authoritative of the aviation authorities out there. So most countries, including Europe, China, generally follow the FAA's guideline. But China, in this case, grounded the plane. I didn't provide that much research here. I actually did read some of the initial report on it. China, a lot of the pilots in China actually issue warning even prior to the first accident. And as it turned out, by the way, the Americans, the Southwest, if you look at the Pilots Association, later investigation showed that there were significant amount of concern. The plane somehow seems to be out of control or very hard to put back into control. After China grounded the plane, every major aviation regulatory bodies in the world started grounding the plane. And when Canada, after US, I think somewhat lobbied for them to keep the plane in flight, after Canada grounding the flight on March 13th, our FAA actually still resisted. It was President Trump ordered the grounding of the MAX, and hence FAA issued the grounding. And as I'm sure we all know, the plane is still on the ground right now. And when it's going to fly again, that is a little bit TBD, but it looks like sometime early next year. So that's what happened. And of course, multiple investigations, as you can imagine, by multiple countries, international boards, FAA, Justice Department, even FBI actually eventually got involved. So what were some of the chilling details that we found today? And I say chilling because we as consumers and as members of our society rely on our government, rely on the various administration to safeguard our safety. And to me, each of these is a significant violation of that trust. So starting with the FAA, for example, we learned that after Lion Air went down, FAA did their statistical model. And their analysis suggests that another accident was likely within the year. So there was actually quite a bit of back channel communication with Boeing, knowing another flight will go down and sort of race against time, try to prevent and fix the software, adding additional sensor, etc., training possibly to the mix to prevent another disaster. Now, I don't know about you, but I felt that if a FAA statistical model suggests that another catastrophic accident could have happened, there should be immediately ground for pausing. By the way, especially FAA still recommend airworthiness after the second accident, knowing the statistical model of the first accident. To me, that's almost unforgivable. But that's another story. The second point here is the investigation further uncovered that the chief technical pilot at the time, Mark Faulkner, and another pilot, Patrick Gustafson, hopefully didn't screw up the name too badly, back in November 2016, so almost 2 years before the accident, experienced similar problem in this case in the simulation. But this data was not reported to FAA. And it's a little bit, as I read through the different reports, it's a little bit mixed. So I wasn't sure it's exact lying versus omission of truth. But however you looked at it, FAA felt that they were lied to. In the Ethiopian Air, so this is on the right side, it should be number 3. I just created this in a hurry, so I missed a couple minor points, so forgive me. The pilots in the Ethiopian Air was able to actually disengage the MCAS system. So what happens after Lion Air, Airbus did update its training. By the way, it required less than an hour of training on an iPad video for the new MCAS system. And the pilot actually didn't know how to disengage it, except it took them too long. In simulation, that later is done in May of this year, pilots had less than 40 seconds to actually fix the plane. So in the case of Ethiopian Air, what's really tragic and sad is they fought and they eventually disengaged MCAS, but it was too late. The last point here is about Boeing itself. and then we'll dive into sort of more the project management side. The MCAS system was originally designed in military refueling plane, and it's been around actually for some time. It's not a completely new system, but it was designed for reliance on two angle of attack sensors. The automatic system was also more limited. At the time, adjusting pitch by a very small amount. And actually, in later research, I may be wrong about the 2.5 degree. It actually could be only 0.6 degree. But let's leave it for what it is. So in the 737 MAX, MCAS rely on just one sensor, and remind you that sensors outside the plane, which is more easily defective, for example, struck by a bird, of all things. And the automatic system was far more aggressive. So all of that, as you can imagine, started creating what I call this perfect storm. And for those of you interested in more, there are plenty of resources. And throughout, you'll see that I have a lot of these resources. So I try to make it as objective, as fact-driven as possible. So let's look at the project program portfolio analysis. And by the way, as you have questions, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, this probably will take less than an hour. Okay. So let's put a little bit context around what this project is. This project started in 2011 for Boeing. This started with Airbus A320neo announced by Airbus. And it's a more fuel efficient plane. Boeing quickly embarked on this design of its 737 when one of their most loyal customer, American Airline, actually decided to buy some Neo A330. So it put the Boeing into a more panic mode, and they're of course months behind Airbus. And as I'm sure people know that in the airline industry, commercial airline industry, it's essentially a duopoly. A duopoly meaning Airbus providing half the market with Boeing the other half, and on a good day, bad day, one of them is going to sell more planes than the other. So they are very, very competitive. The Airbus A320, a more fuel-efficient jet, essentially had a larger engine. And because the larger engine, it was able to fly further, and with the fuel efficiency about 15%, it also can fly further. So Boeing essentially followed the same game plan. They decided to put a bigger engine on their 737. But the trouble for Boeing, engineering trouble, is that the Boeing is actually a pretty old plane. The 737 flew back in the 1967, give or take, is when it was first designed. And the plane was actually noticeably closer to the ground, its winged, I should say, closer to the ground than the Airbus. So while Airbus had plenty of clearance, ground clearance between the wing of the plane and the ground to put in a new engine, Boeing actually didn't. So Boeing actually had to put the engine a little bit higher on the wing. That changed the aerodynamic of the flight. So what happened is during the flight, they knew that the pitch of the plane became an issue, especially during takeoff. And the MCAS system was added as a system to automatically adjust the plane a little bit downward so it goes into this sort of the safety pattern and doesn't stall. And this was proven, by the way, as a good technology, for example, on a refueling plane. And that was where the MCAS was first developed. You can imagine a refueling plane holding so much of the gasoline, and the jet fuel is extremely heavy. So this system was actually pretty perfected in that sense for the commercial plane. But putting on the commercial plane has a lot of problems. And here we'll start looking at the problem from the project, program, and portfolio perspective. So let me first define what is a project, what is a program, and what is a portfolio, and the management effort around that. For those of us who probably read up on project management, a guide to project management body of knowledge, we know that project is defined largely as a temporary endeavor undertaken to create something unique, whether it's a unique product, outcome, deliverable, or results. And so project is fairly narrowly focused. So if you're a project manager on Boeing, And by the way, I don't have any further insights into Boeing. So this is my take on how Boeing could have looked at this. But if you're a project manager, project engineer, project leader working on this plane, 737 MAX, you will largely look at, in this case, your success factor is primarily getting the plane done. Right. I think a lot of us project professionals, we know one of our most important imperative is deliver things on schedule, on budget, delivering the right scope, and maybe at the right quality. So it's a fairly narrow focus. Program management, or what is a program? PMI defined program is a collection of related projects, and that's undertaken together so you can achieve benefits, which largely could be synergy, that you otherwise wouldn't have. My definition of program is a little bit more rigorous. And my definition really just adds one more word. To me, it's a highly related project. So to me, a loosely set of related projects is actually more like a portfolio, which I'll come to. But if the highly relatedness means that the failure of a single project greatly endanger the ultimate goal of the overall program, then that component project does belong to that tightly knit program. So if you put on a program perspective, which is broader than project, a program goal in this case will be the success of the Boeing 737 MAX series, not only building the plane, which is a project goal, but also making sure it's airworthiness, make sure you could sell the plane, make sure you could train the pilot. So there are multiple projects that one can have under a program. Portfolio, which is sort of the broadest umbrella. Portfolio, in this case, is a collection of projects, programs, and other components. And in that sense, that the connectedness, interconnectedness of these project program and other components are fairly loose. Generally, a portfolio serves some kind of business goal. So if you have a company selling candies and cookies, you may have two portfolios, one for candies, various type, one for cookies, for example. In this case of Boeing, I look at their commercial airline line of business as a portfolio. They have others, of course. They're a defense contractor. They play a major role in aerospace in engineering as well, beyond just the commercial flight. So portfolio management, in the Boeing's case, probably have something like 5 major set of portfolios. But in this case, narrowing, focusing on this portfolio, it would have been the commercial line of business. And of course, you could imagine in there's a lot of other planes, 747, 767, 757, so on and so forth. Again, I welcome questions, so feel free to jump in if you have any questions and just use the chat to address them. So challenges from a project perspective. Now, because projects are narrowly focused, I'm predominantly going to look at really from the scope, schedule, and cost perspective. There's also risks that I'll embed throughout the presentation. Boeing reportedly pushed the project team to develop the new plane at twice the normal pace. For their part, they started a month after the Airbus A380neo, and Airbus initially was selling actually quite significantly better in around 2012, 13, 14, 15. And then Boeing started catching up. But the extra speed to approve, for example, technical drawing analysis has its consequence. So in this case, we have read a lot of reports that engineers were pushed to submit technical drawing designs roughly at twice the speed of normal, and of course, skipping over or at least glossing over some of the safeties. We also learned that engineers claimed Boeing prioritized cost over safety. And this, of course, becomes a fundamental question of value. The original MCAS system, as I mentioned earlier, was based on multiple angle of attack sensors. In the 737 MAX, it was based on a single one. And also that the MCAS actually had an indicator that could have been installed in the airplane, but it wasn't installed in the Lion Air because it was considered an enhancement option. So the culprit didn't actually have the sensor. So in the case of the Boeing Lion Air, the pilots reasonably actually know what was going on. So think about it from prospective pilots. They don't see it in their guide. It's not in the emergency procedure. There's nothing on their instrument panel suggesting that something's going wrong. And of course, all these are cost factors. One of the other factors on the costs, later I'll come down to, is I put at more of a program level, is a lack of training. So I'll plant a seed for that. But just looking at the project very quickly, so the quick development effort impacted the thoroughness of analysis as MCAS went through a fundamental overhaul. So what happened is the MCAS system, when it first introduced for the 737 MAX, it was meant to play a pretty low-key sort of back office or automated function that would just keep the pitch within the stable zone. However, through multiple iterations, as they had encountered problems, as engineers were complaining, the MCAS system actually went through fairly fundamental overhaul. But nobody actually sat back and asked, what does it mean? What does it mean for safety? What does it mean for flight instruction? So it went essentially unnoticed. And to make matter worse, later FAA would claim that Boeing actually lied to it in terms of the system and its capability. So what you have then in this case is a perfect storm ruling. Three major factors, of course there could be more, for example, lying and not reporting issues, but one is this just unpredictable system change. And if you think of the plane as an overall system, an automated system that kicks in without notification or warning, now suddenly got more authority and make bigger pitch to the plane, so bigger adjustments than it otherwise would. And remember, it relies on one sensor. So if that sensor is faulty and the system is pushing the plane downward, which is essentially what happened in both cases, the pilots either didn't know in the Lion Air case or in the Ethiopian's case, didn't have enough time to adjust. There was little training. They weren't even aware for the most part at that time, people, that there was a new system. A lot of people disrespected stuff because the pilots, and later we'll come back to Lion Air, but the pilots didn't know that there was something that they couldn't control. They just couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. And then the third, from a project perspective at least, the indicator light, somehow due to cost saving, or you could say corporate greed because they wanted more money for the enhancement, was not installed. Let's look at now the next level, the program level. At the program level, what we learned is that there are at least a couple major projects that ought to be considered. So if you think about the flight worthiness and the success of the 737 MAX, not just the limited project view, right? Project manager has a bad reputation often. We are often, and probably rightly, blamed for finishing something and then toss it over the fence. I hope is somebody on the other side of the fence will catch it. In IT, for example, in my previous work at running large projects, I'm often fighting with, let's say, the head of the support. Okay, I'm done with the project, you ready to hold it? And the support will say, no, you didn't give me enough documentation. We were in the discussion, we are not ready. From a program perspective, of course, you try to solve that problem because programs, again, are a collection of highly related projects. So in this case, for the Boeing 737 MAX, this is just my view. Again, I don't know how Boeing looked at this, but I would think there should be at least 5 major projects within this overall program. The first one being the project to develop the plane. The second, of course, getting the FAA approval. After all, if you define a plane, you don't get approval, you're not going to make money. Third, you need to get the pilot support. In hindsight, the pilots actually were not really supporting the plane. So we'll come down to that as well. 4, selling the plane. In this case, commercializing, marketing, selling. You want it to be a financial success. And then 5th, which in some ways you could argue could be outside the scope of the program, but I think at least for a major plane, that should be at least included, which is really running the operation for some time until it hits a steady state. And this is what I call the transition to operation, or the airworthiness, or the transition of the knowledge to the team that will ultimately manage this plane through its entire life cycle. So those are 5 major planes. So let's look at this, what happened. Well, first of all, we know that there were disconnect between the development, so project number 1 and project number 2. FAA is right now rightly angry. And to be honest, it may be very angry for selfish reason, because I think there are actually a good part of the blame does go to the FAA anyway. But regardless, at this point, they are saying we didn't get the right information. Boeing hidden certain facts from us, and ultimately, some will even claim they lied to us, even though at the time, whether it was a lying or, let's say, a misconstrued information or selective information filtering, that is TBD. The second is that the excessive focus on cost saving and schedule, do it faster, lead to a lot of poor program integration. And to me, MCAS integration into 737 MAX is actually a good example. So it may be technically under one big project, but there's at least multiple sub-projects within that. Because MCAS wasn't originally meant for the Boeing 737 series. It was added on because of a problem of too close to the ground, and hence you had to move the engine up. The MCAS went from a very mild passive system in the background to aggressive system. And it had a lot much more authority to guide the plane, for example, than it was ever designed. But there was no review of, and maybe there was review, but not thorough review enough to question that. And of course, there were a lot of problems with the software, and we know that Boeing's trying to fix the software. It also went from relying multiple sensors to one. To me, this is a problem that crossed both between the project and program. And lastly, training, which is number 3 in that sense, obtaining the pilot support. Now, initially, Boeing did have pilot support. Initially, Boeing's big point of selling this 737 MAX to Southwest, American, United was, hey guys, use my plane. It's largest saying, no more training needed. As we know, it's very expensive to put pilots in training, especially using simulator. So it was actually a big selling point that the pilot didn't require any new training, and they could just literally jump into the new plane and start flying. I mean, that's what was assumed. We know, of course, that is no longer true. And by the way, to actually even add to me a real concern, whether Boeing is changing its culture or not, after the second crash in May 2019, so 2 months after the Ethiopian crash, Boeing reissued the recommendation for training. And in there, even though now there's mention of ANCAP system, in video training, it still did not recommend simulator training. And to me, that is just another huge, huge breach of trust. Third, excessive focus on commercialization, beating the Airbus A380neo commercially. So what it did is essentially minimize everybody's complaint. It pushed the plane forward, the development cycle forward, knowing very well it's twice as fast, knowing very well that then the chief engineer filed complaints. And they even deflected when the Lion Air first went down, and even a little bit after the Ethiopian went down, saying, well, you know, these are foreign pilots. They were trained differently. They don't have the same standard of rigor as the American pilots. Now, whether that is true or not is way to be seen. There's still investigation ongoing. I'm sure people can be better trained. But keep in mind that in this case for Lion Air, well, they didn't even train MCAS. There was no recommendation for training. And even in the case of Ethiopian Air, it's 1 hour of video. So somehow, given the magnitude and the gravity of the situation, I just don't see that being in proportional. So to me, I really believe Boeing trying to perhaps salvage their reputation, but in the process hurting them more. This one, I'm sorry, there's actually a typo here. This meant to say portfolio perspective. If you think about a portfolio perspective, it's really the success of the commercial airline business. And it's a big part of their business. If you go on their website and look at Airbus, there are actually about 10 different major products and services: 737 Next Gen, 737 MAX, 747 -8, 757, 767, 787, and there are a couple of actually branches of 787. According to internal reports, and you could have to read it between the lines, I couldn't find any serious article that talk about Boeing being overworked and overstressed during the time period that we're talking about, which is largely around that 2013, 14, 15 time period. We do know a couple of things though. Boeing 787 Dreamliner, for example, started the development in 2003, but it didn't go well. It actually was 3 years behind schedule, and even after it launched, some of you may actually remember, in around January of 2013, FAA actually grounded all 787 Dreamliner because of lithium battery fire. And lithium battery being a rare earth metal, it burns extremely hot. It actually could burn through the hull of the plane. So hence Boeing felt that had to ground the plane. FAA grounded the plane. And Boeing, of course, complied, which means that Boeing were really, really busy trying to solve another problem. Around the same time, they also had a lot of work done on 747-400 series. And even though the work technically finished, the product ramp-up took so much effort that it eats into the 2013, 2014, 2015. And these are just the two major projects that we know that they had going on at the time. According to some of the reports on 737 MAX 8, looking at the pilots' complaints, and this is Boeing pilots and engineer complaints, you could read between the lines that people were just genuinely flat out busy working on different projects. So from a portfolio concern, these are more strategic concerns. I raised really two concerns, and there could be more, of course. One is resources. Did Boeing have sufficient resource, engineers, project program leaders, executive oversight? We know there are articles out there, by the way, complaining the board being sleeping at the wheel. But that's an overboarding issue, somewhat related to this case, but could be due to other factors. So I didn't put that in as a major factor. And then, of course, Boeing, FAA itself asked Boeing why the test pilots hide the severe issues that they have. More importantly, and I think more fundamentally as a consumer, I'm sure like a lot of you, we sit on airplanes, the real question is, can we trust Boeing? Was Boeing following its own principle? And they had a beautiful webpage, by the way, of all the principles that one would love to think that any commercial airline company would embrace. But here, to me, there was clearly that breach of trust. Now, I cover this sort of summarizes at least where we are today from a project program portfolio perspective. There were, by the way, a lot of other issues that this presentation didn't cover. As you can imagine, given all the various investigations, we'll be spending hours talking about them. But I did want to call out two of them, and that should send some chills to all of us as well. FAA, for example. FAA was largely ineffective, at least in this particular case. Maybe they were understaffed, or maybe they were regulatory-wise captured by Boeing. Regulatory capture is a term that we sometimes use when the leaders of these associations or administration that's designed to safeguard consumer safety came from the industry themselves. So they may go back to the industry. So essentially the industry, in this case, aviation, Boeing, had a lot of, I wouldn't call it conflict of interest because that's perhaps a bit strong. At that moment, there may not be a conflict of interest. But over that stretch of one's career, these people play multiple roles. So for example, in the FAA publication on pilot training requirement in the fall of 2017, did not require MCAS training. This is even after a foreign regulator, in this case a Brazilian regulator, came to inspect the plane, ready to purchase the plane, Boeing 737 MAX, came up with 60 bulletins in which Boeing need to comply before it could fly in Brazil. Our FAA, and one of them, of course, is training of NCAS, our FAA did not adopt that. Which raised the question, did ethnocentrism, the belief that we are better than other culture, played a role? And this is not only at the point in 2017, but after Lion Air happened. I often ask the question, will we have another major crash like the Ethiopian Air if Lion Air is not Lion Air, but it's American Airline, United, Delta, and the plane crashed in America? So I do think there is a case to look into this cross-cultural aspect of this case. But again, that's for another day. The other point is FAA was the last to ground the plane. And in some ways, it's rather shameful, of course. We also found out, and this is actually through a whistleblower case that came up with the Office of Special Counsel in September 2019. That whistleblower essentially said, you know what, FAA wasn't even equipped to certify airline pilots because their own instructor lacked certification in the training to certify other people. And that's a case. So anybody interested, you could see the links there. The airline themselves, by the way, do take some blame. The Lion Air, for example, in their final report, did blame their own pilots. And what's chilling about it is the flight right before the flight that crashed, that fatal flight 610 flight. The pilots and the passenger actually lost control of the plane as well. And passengers were vomiting, they were panicking on the flight right before the next flight, which is the fatal flight. And yet, for whatever reason, maybe making money, Lion Air didn't ground or inspect that plane further, which could have saved, of course, 189 lives. So there are plenty of issues, and this report, or my report, makes no claim that this is conclusive. So the key lessons. I think there are so many key lessons here. I actually started putting them. I just realized it's just a laundry list at this point. Almost for many of us who are project professionals, I'm sure you spotted all the things that possibly went wrong. And I think, so here what I will cite is we are human. We do make errors. And project professionals probably make more errors than the average human because we work in a constrained environment and we often tackle tough problems. Frankly, if the problem is easy, we'd be out of job. We often have fires blaming all around us. What is the latest issue? Did somebody come to work late and that person's so important to the project, everything started to be on hold. The vendor didn't deliver on time, impacting the next item on the list. Right? So these are fires that we have every day. And sometimes, even with our best of intention, projects are not as successful as we'd like to be. And of course, even worse, even when we deliver something we thought was pretty good, people can still legitimately complain it took too long, cost too much money, people work too hard. In IT, we have a term called death marches. And customer complain, why was it so hard? Right? So we live in that world. But to me, instead of picking on individual problems, we should think a little bit more holistically. And here is where I put in my 2 cents of thoughts in. For high-stake projects, programs, and portfolios, in which the lives of people, or it could be other important stakes, that's really on the watch, we need to have a guidepost that's just beyond methodologies or standards. And I work on PMBOK standard or ISO standards, right? I think we need a new code of ethics, or at least addition to the current code of ethics, and something that I call the duty of care, which is essentially borrowed from accounting as well as other industries. So what is duty of care? Duty of care is an obligation for project professionals in which we adhere to a standard of reasonable care while delivering projects and minimizing potential harm to the stakeholders. And this includes the customer, the end users, and ultimately the society. And we do this by, 1, define upfront for that particular project, organization, team, or industry, what does reasonable care mean? Identifying, analyzing, evaluating how our products and services will be used and highlight potential harms. It doesn't mean we can address all harms. Everything has a trade-off, and we know that in project management. The fact that nothing is perfect gives us the next evolution, next phase of the project, or next iteration. But we should include harm as a key decision factors when we're making those trade-off decisions. Furthermore, if there are harms, but we can't address them for whatever reason, maybe it is indeed too expensive, that doesn't mean we should just shove it under the rug. We should communicate that. We should make that open so people are aware that nothing is genuinely perfect and we could do better in the next phase. So that's how I see, and I'm still perfecting my view on this, but that's how I see currently. And the examples of sort of this lapse of duty of care mentality is evident. We just talked about Boeing. I don't think the engineers, the project managers in Boeing came to work every single day saying we're going to design a plane that's a flying coffin. I don't believe that. I believe these are genuinely good people making good decisions for the most part that optimizes what they were given, whether it's schedule restrictions, cost restrictions, etc. And I think I speak that for a lot of us. We try to do the best that we can. But the Boeing's own philosophy was set aside for the sake of expediency. And this critical level of gap led ultimately to the path of making decisions that are really unsafe for the ultimate customer, which is the consumer, the flyers, the passengers on the plane. There are, by the way, a lot of other examples. I actually wrote a paper, a blog article on the Flint water crisis. Same thing. I don't think the engineers and the project managers transferring water or exchanging water source in Flint, Michigan was intended to let poison 80 of our kids, not to mention let poison a lot of people, but 80 cases that came forth. Or even the Volkswagen. Now, Volkswagen could be a little different. It may not actually even be an ethical issue. It could be actually a legal breach. But at least for the people who followed through on that, that probably was also a lack of that duty of care. Most recently, Marriott, for example, had 5 million records unencrypted. I mean, imagine in 2019, somebody keeps data unencrypted of 5 million customer passport data. And the list can just go on. So that's why I think we need a different mindset when we think about projects. Well, now I'm coming to an end. So what are the next steps that I recommend? On learning, I think we should learn. We should be curious. We should pursue and try to understand more as we become better of ourselves. On learning, for example, my company, PM Advisory, we strive to be a data-driven, fact-based company. And we try to provide the most credible training and trusted advice to our clients and become a better company in our own right. So my recommendation for those of you who are still staying on is I'll make this recording available, review the sources. If that makes you want to understand more, that's great. Improve how you think about the problems at the various levels, the project, program, portfolio. Join our future webinar. Every month we try to deliver something that's refreshing, interesting. And of course, pursue certification to become a better you. And as a small plug for our company, next slide will show you some of the upcoming classes. We do training across project, program, portfolio, risk, and agile. And if you do use the coupon code, as you mentioned, it's really only works this month for the next 30 days or so. The webinar 20%, you could get 20% off our standard rate. Some of our courses may already be on sale, so it may not be applicable. Very quickly, this shows you a current plan of the near future courses. As mentioned, we have courses in project, program, portfolio management, risk management, and agile. And some of our courses are live virtual, others are local in classroom, so they vary a little bit. Thank you, that's all I have, and I'll be open to questions very soon. But as I promised people attending here, you could earn up to 1 PDU if you use this claim code. So you could see the claim code here and the PDUs you could claim against the technical aspect, strategic, and leadership. And the maximum is 1 PDU. So Given what I have spent 50 minutes, I want to see if there are any good questions. If there are any questions, you could use chat. Going once, going twice. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us and spending the hour with us on this presentation. I hope you find that this is a fairly dense presentation because I didn't want everything to be just light and easy, but I want it to be thought-provoking and really get you to think about the project, program, and portfolio management. If this interests you, feel free to come back to our site. We have monthly webinars. Next week, for example, we're running another webinar on Beyond PMP, really designed for senior project professional who's interested in program and portfolio management. So if you're interested, come to our website, pmoadvisory.com, and sign up for that presentation. Last call for questions. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for spending your lunchtime with us, and I hope you find this time to be worth spending. Have a wonderful day, and if you have questions, comments, you have my email address here. Feel free to look me up, connect with me on LinkedIn, or give us a call. Again, thank you so much, and hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.